There are many words that have echoed across the 40K franchise and have helped to define its very essence. None more so than these. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. Today I wanted to dive deep into the lore of Warhammer and explore the facets of the lore that you'll find in Space Marine 2. And I say facets, but man, Space Marine 2 is one of those games that is absolutely fantastic for representing the lore of 40K. There are a lot of other sources for knowledge on this topic, as I'm sure you know. Be sure to check out your favorite lore channels with 40K in mind, mine personally is Luton09. But for my part, I wanted to give a broad overview and treat people as though they've never even heard of 40K before. In this video, I intend to provide you with a primer to the universe. So, with that in mind, we'll be talking about the setting, our key factions, including the Imperium, Chaos, and the Tyranids, and of course, the plot of the first Space Marine game, so you're caught up on that as well. There's also a lot of extra stuff to talk about from the second game, but if you're willing to watch another video on that, this video is already going to be long enough, so I'll be making more of those as time goes on. For now though, let's begin explaining the lore of this vast and brutal universe. So first, let's talk about the setting. 40K, as the name implies, is set in the 41st millennium. Well, technically now it's set in the 42nd millennium. Time has progressed such that we're in an era that the new millennium has just started. It's literally just ticked over. Unfortunately, things aren't exactly going great right now for humanity, aka the Imperium of Man. Yes, we've spread out across most of the stars, and we have an empire that covers most of the galaxy, but man, it is a big galaxy and there are a lot of things that want to kill and or eat us. Massive warbands or wars of orcs roam the stars, conquering worlds for plunder in the name of their war bosses like Ghazghul. The long-dead Necrons, immortal machine constructs of terrible technological power, have begun to rise from their tomb worlds, uniting under their overlords and pharaons. And mankind's greatest enemy, the very traitors that left the Imperium of Man in ruin 11,000 years ago, after the betrayal of the Horus heresy, have split the galaxy asunder. The forces of chaos have expanded out from the Eye of Terror and have created the Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, cutting the galaxy in half and leaving half of the Imperium cut off from the light of the Astronomicon, making space travel incredibly dangerous and unreliable, leaving many worlds ripe for the slaughter. It all sounds completely mad, and that's because, well, yeah, it is. Warhammer 40K is all about scale. Scale on the maddest of degrees. This is the peak of possible grimdark. In any typical planetary or system conflict within 40K, it is not unusual for casualties to range between the billions and trillions, depending on where the conflict is taking place and who's involved. And the scale of the destruction is absolutely unbelievable until you see it. You know, there's that phrase of turning things up to 11? Well, 40K appropriately turns it up to 1100. For perhaps the best example of this, just take a brief look at a Space Marine themselves and compare them to a normal-sized human. Space Marines are commonly about 7 or 8 foot tall and are armored head to toe in ceramite suits of armor plating that are just about as durable as some tanks. They're genetically enhanced super soldiers with extra organs including a second heart, and they contain some of the genetic material created by the God Emperor of mankind himself. They fire bolters, which are not your typical machine gun. In fact, don't you dare even make such a heretical comparison. Bolters fire a variety of rocket-propelled, armor-piercing munitions that detonate like grenades inside their targets. Being a normal human and shooting some calibers of bolter without proper training and assistance can lead to a shattered arm. And as for when they get into melee, well, they have this. God bless the chainsword and its biting righteous teeth, that they may scour the enemy's offending limbs from their heretical bodies. Space Marines are just one example of the absolutely insane scale of the 40k universe, and it's this scale that really helps to define it. When normal humans in the Imperial Guard or Astra Militarum go to war, they get sent in the millions or billions to battle. They're often armed with little more than a single lasgun, and that's it. And as for the lifespan of some of these guardsmen, well, it's a commonly cited possibility that in some conflicts, members of the Imperial Guard on the front line have a life expectancy of around 15 or so hours. And when they die in their millions and billions, they are not even remembered. They are just a footnote. They do not matter. If you're ever wondering why something in 40k is that way, sometimes the answer is simply scale. Again, the conflicts are magnificently brutal, and it's not just mankind taking part in all of these. On a typical battlefield of gargantuan scale, the orcs might make a 50-foot-tall gargant scrap construct. But it's okay, because humanity may well have deployed a few Titan legions to contest them. I could go on, but hopefully you get the picture. Whatever you're imagining, imagine more of it, and bigger, and more brutal. So with that in mind, if you're going to understand Space Marine 2 and the world of 40k that you're going to step into, we should start talking about our core factions. And that means we need to start with the one that you will be fighting for, the Imperium of Man. Human history in 40k is a long and tragic affair. Now, almost all of humanity lives under the Imperium of Man in the 42nd millennium, a great fascist superstate that rules the stars with an iron fist, and with a great degree of inefficiency. It is a rotting, wasting remnant of humanity's greatness that has long since faded, but still holds the torchlight of humanity against all the horrors of the stars. There is a lot to talk about when it comes to recounting humanity's history before the time of the Imperium and in the lead up to where we are now, and I am not going to go over all of it, even though this video is going to run quite long. If you want more detail, I highly recommend Luton's Emperor of Mankind lore videos. He really helps to set the stage, and his commitment to detail is something that I aspire to live up to. But for the sake of brevity here, I'm not going to go in as much detail as he would. I just want to give you the primer, and as a result, we're going to be covering the broad strokes of things. For the first several thousand years, humanity would technologically ascend past the heights that we reached here in the 21st century, and would begin to colonize the galaxy. This was slow at first until the discovery of warp travel, which allows ships to reach their destination faster by passing through the Imperium, or the warp. The warp is a bad place. Don't go there. It's space hell on steroids, and it's ruled by the dark gods of chaos. We'll get onto those in a bit. When humanity first went out into the stars, warp travel was dangerous, but was still feasible. And for many millennium, it was a reliable way to get around the galaxy. But then, thanks to the actions of the Eldari and the birth of a certain fourth chaos god of all things demonetized in the 25th millennium, the warp became volatile, and great warp storms ravaged the galaxy, including all of humanity's empire. This made warp travel and warp communication much less reliable and much more dangerous, and this would be the start of massive problems for humanity. A near-apocalyptic situation had suddenly emerged, because all of their empire was connected by either warp travel or warp communication. Worlds like Earth, or Terra as it's known in Warhammer, were completely dependent on imported resources. Without the ability to trade and travel through the warp, humanity was quickly set ablaze. These events would lead to a complete societal collapse for humanity, and all of its various planets would fall out of contact with each other. Whilst some colonies were self-sufficient and would prosper in lucky isolation, most worlds devolved into barbarism. On Earth, great techno-barbarian leaders rose to conquer the once mighty capital of humanity. It was left in utter ruins. Humanity could not have been weaker at this moment in time, but from the ashes of human civilization stepped a figure from the shadows, knowing that now was the time to act. For many millennia, he had been silently watching humanity and waiting. He would come to be known as the Emperor of Mankind. A remarkably tall man with a presence that commanded respect and loyalty from those around him. He was supremely skilled in the ways of combat and science, and was a remarkably powerful psyker, one of those who had been blessed with psychic powers. The Emperor sought to take his place as the master of mankind, and to do so he would first need to reunite Terra, then Sol, then the rest of the galaxy. And eventually, he would do just that. Once Terra had been made secure and was truly his dominion, he reached out to the survivors of Mars, the so-called Cult Mechanicum, who would one day be known as the Adeptus Mechanicus, a human faction that had fled underground and turned to machines for their salvation. They would bind machines to their flesh and embrace the certainty of steel so that they might survive. What started perhaps as pragmatism quickly developed into dogma, and then into faith. They began to believe in the divinity of the machine and that there was a machine god, an intrinsic force of logic and knowledge within the universe. The physical avatar of this machine god is known as the Omnissiah. And after arriving on Mars, many of the Mechanicum's tech priests looked up to the Emperor and thought that he was the Omnissiah. Using this to his political advantage and demonstrating his supreme scientific prowess, the Emperor went to the Martian Parliament on Olympus Mons, and along with the leading magi of the Mechanicum signed the Treaty of Mars. This would forge an official alliance between the Mechanicum of Mars and the newly born Imperium of Man. And the Emperor was going to need them too, because he'd need technology and great foundries for what came next. In secret, the Emperor had created the plans for 20 legions of incredible warriors that would be mankind's shield and sword in the times ahead. They were the Adeptus Astartes, the Emperor's Angels of Death, the Space Marine Legions. They were genetically engineered super soldiers, and each of them was led by a Primarch. Each of these Primarchs was created using some of the Emperor's own DNA, and each had been designed by him to excel at certain traits above others. Whilst the Primarch Magnus would have superior psychic powers, the Primarch Angron would inherit martial prowess and ferocity. Each of these 20 Primarchs would lead one of the 20 Space Marine Legions, and each of the Legion's genetic material was taken directly from each Primarch. This would be the army that the Emperor would use to reunite humanity, either by force of will or force of arms. But before he could finish his project, there were interlopers. The gods of chaos intervened. The exact reasons for their intervention is not well understood or documented, and is the subject of much rumor and debate, but the result of the intervention was all the same. The Emperor's sons, his Primarchs, his philosopher generals that were meant to lead his legions, were scattered across the galaxy. This was a terrible blow to the Emperor's plans, but they were still unchanged. The Emperor would embark with his 20 legions of Space Marines upon what was known as the Great Crusade. Originally, it had simply been meant to reunite Terra and her lost colonies under a single rule by the Emperor of Mankind. But with his lost Primarch sons, there was now a second objective. He would need to find them all and reunite them with their legions. And in time, he would find every last one of them. Lionel Johnson, Fulgrim, Perturabo, Leman Russ, Rogel Dawn, Conrad Kurz, Sanguinius, Ferrus Manus, Angron, Robuta Gilliman, Mortarion, Magnus the Red, Lorgar, Vulcan, Corvus Corax, Alfarius, Omegon, the two unknown Primarchs, and of course, his future War Master, Horus Lupercal. It was the Emperor's intention that one day Horus would take his place as the one leading the Great Crusade, and when the responsibility was passed to Horus late in the days of the Crusade, the title of War Master would be formally bestowed upon him as the Emperor returned to Terra to work in secret on a research project that would change the fates of all humanity if it was to be successful. The project was webway travel. Beneath the Golden Throne on Terra, the Emperor was establishing a link to the old Eldari webway system, a series of interdimensional passageways that allowed travel between the stars without the use of the dangerous warp. It was far safer and far faster. This would have been the Emperor's greatest gift to mankind, a bright and prosperous future without the threat of extinction due to the Imperium's instability. Had the Emperor's vision panned out, and had he achieved his goals, mankind would have grasped dominion over all the stars. But unfortunately, the Emperor, and all of mankind, was betrayed from within. Through the machinations of the Dark Gods and their tainted puppets within the ranks of the Space Marine legions, corruption began to spread, first to the Marines, and then in time to their Primarchs. Worst of all, Horus Lupercal was amongst them. As a supreme strategist, Horus was a powerful leader, but as the ruling champion of the four Chaos Gods, Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh, he would become one of the most powerful entities in the universe, capable of potentially rivaling the Emperor himself. Quietly, and without much warning, a split was beginning to form within the Space Marine legions. Horus would gather those Primarchs who were either opposed to the Emperor in some manner, or who were corrupted by chaos to his side. This led to the legions of the Sons of Horus, Iron Warriors, Alpha Legion, Wordbearers, Death Guard, World Eaters, Night Lords, and Emperor's Children all turning traitor, as well as the Rubric Marines of the Thousand Suns Legion, who would later join on account of trickery by the Chaos God Tzeentch. Many of the traitor Primarchs would eventually ascend into Demon Princes, even if they had not originally held treacherous intent. But regardless of what their fates might be later on, those fates were sealed on the planets of Istvan III and Istvan V, with the death of the Loyalists within their own legions, and then an outright massacre of Loyalist legions such as Vulcan's Salamanders and Ferrus Manus's Iron Hands. With these two terrible actions, the moment of peace was over. The Horus heresy would begin. The Horus heresy is one of the most important events in all of mankind's history, and would go on for 9 years, ending in the siege of Terra itself. Horus and the Emperor would face each other in a battle within Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit. In the battle, at first it seemed like Horus Lupercal would be victorious, for even as the arch-traitor dealt grievous wounds to the Emperor of mankind, the Emperor could not bring himself to strike Horus down. Such was his love for his son. The circumstances that changed this are shrouded in a little mystery. Seemingly, though, because of a brutal action committed by Horus, the Emperor saw that there was no saving him from the corruption of chaos. The Emperor's body was broken and ruined, but using his incredible psychic power, he was able to destroy Horus so utterly that the arch-traitor's very essence and soul was burned away in psychic fire, meaning that even the Chaos Gods could not resurrect him as a demon prince or claim his soul for his service. Horus was defeated, and with the death of the War Master, the traitor legions were sent reeling, and the Loyalist forces rallied, winning the day. But the victory was won at a staggering cost. The Imperium, over 9 years of war, had been left in ruins. Thousands of Space Marines had died or turned traitor. Every facet of the Imperium's military, from the great fleets of the Imperial Navy to the men of the Astra Militarum to the Titan legions of the Adeptus Mechanicus, lay shattered by the heresy. The Primarch Sanguinius had laid down his life facing Horus before the Emperor could reach him, and the Emperor himself was barely recognizable as a man anymore. He was still alive, but was more of a corpse. In the aftermath of his titanic battle against Horus, the Emperor was rushed to the Imperial Palace by his custodian guard and his son Rogel Dawn, Terra's great defender and the Primarch of the Imperial Fists. From here, on the Golden Throne, the Emperor's spirit could be maintained, and his psychic power could continue to light the beacon of the Astronomicon across the Imperium, allowing Imperial navigators to still make their way through the warp correctly by using the Lighthouse of Terra as a guidepost. But even this had a cost. The Emperor's soul needed to be sustained, and so every day, to maintain the Emperor's spirit and the Astronomicon itself, 1,000 human psychers, those blessed with psychic potential, had to be sacrificed to the Golden Throne. In such circumstances, Imperial society began to fester and decay, much like the Emperor's body. In time, a new change would come across the Imperium of Man. In the time when the Emperor had sought to reunite humanity, the Imperial truth reigned supreme, a declaration that there was no God and that mankind's empire would be secular in nature. The only individuals granted an exception to this were the cult mechanicum of Mars, and their belief in the Omnissiah was, for a time, the only thing close to religion that existed within mankind as an entire civilization. But, in the aftermath of the Horus heresy, this imperial truth would fade. Slowly, worship of the Emperor would begin to flourish. This has expanded in such a fashion that 11,000 years after his wounding at the Siege of Terra, the Emperor of Mankind is now referred to as the God Emperor of Mankind, and institutions such as the Ecclesiarchy have enforced this idea as a state religion. It permeates through all facets of society, and a disbelief in the God Emperor of Mankind is now seen as heresy, something punishable by death. Where before humanity was primed to return to galactic and technological dominance, now, in the 42nd millennium, they are a superstitious and dogmatic people, ruled by the iron fist of faith in the God Emperor. What's even more remarkable about this, though, is that thanks to the belief of the trillions upon trillions upon trillions of individuals throughout the Imperium in the God Emperor of Mankind, the Emperor has indeed become something of a god within the warp. He is not a chaos god, but his psychic presence within the warp and some small proof of something reaching divinity can be seen. This divinity is known to manifest upon some of mankind's greatest battlefields in its most dire conflicts. The living saints of the Adeptus Sororitas and the Ecclesiarchy are but one great example of this. But this was but one of the many changes to the Imperium that followed the Horus heresy. The other was the complete reorganization of the military structures of the Imperium itself, including the Space Marine legions. And it's here that the Ultramarines' Primarch, Robuta Guilliman, comes into focus. He was seen as the prime successor to the Emperor of Mankind, with Horus and Sanguinius both dead. He made his assessments and declared that part of what created the Horus heresy was the vast nature of the Astartes legions. If a single legion of Space Marines turned against the Imperium, there could be as many as 100,000 Marines turning traitor at once. To combat this, Robuta Guilliman proposed a new measure within a great doctrine that he wrote called the Codex Astartes. As well as a primer and tactical guide for the Astartes Marines, it would also mandate that the legions should be broken up into chapters, where legions previously could be numberless if they grew fast enough, and even reached as many as 250,000. These new chapters would never contain more than 1,000 men each, and thus even if a chapter fell to chaos, it would not be a rebellion on the scale of the heresy. The other remaining Primarchs, such as Rogel Dawn and Leman Russ, looked disdainfully upon such an idea, but begrudgingly, they would all agree to it, even if some kept relics of their old legion structure, more so than others. And so it was that the legions were broken up, and the chapters were founded. And so here we are, 11,000 years later, with the Imperium under perpetual threat, a new age of chaos rising, and more darkness than ever pressing in around the Imperium. Before we move on though, there are probably a few things I should explain about the way things work in the Imperium generally. Two things in particular. The first is the Inquisition, and the second is just about planets generally. The Inquisition is an independent and autonomous branch of governance within the Imperium. The authority of the Inquisition supersedes that of anyone in the Imperium except other higher-stationed Inquisitor members and the Emperor himself. As an organization, the Inquisition only answers to the Emperor. And they are exactly what they sound like. They were created in response to the Horus heresy by one of the Emperor's closest confidants, Malcador the Sigillite, and their objective is to root out heresy wherever they find it in the Imperium and maintain the purity of mankind at any cost. And I really do mean at any cost. If the Inquisition suspects anyone of heresy, they have the authority to execute them on the spot without any questions being asked. They can conscript any member of the Imperium into their service, from the lowliest of peasants on a feudal world to a planetary or sector governor that may be responsible for the fate of billions of lives. Everyone, even the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines themselves, has to answer to the authority of the Inquisition. There are many branches or ordos to the Inquisition that each specialize in their own selective tasks, but the three most significant ordos are the Ordo Xenos, Ordo Hereticus, and Ordo Malleus. All three of them are going to be somewhat relevant to our story today, with the Ordo Malleus concerning itself with the forces of the Warp, Chaos, and Demons, who will definitely play a part in our story. The Ordo Hereticus doing exactly as their name suggests, rooting out heretics and witches in all places within the Imperium of Man, maintaining the faith in the Emperor. And the Ordo Xenos, who are concerned with the expansion of dangerous alien or Xenos threats throughout the Imperium of Man, and who are also responsible for the Death Watch, a collection of veteran space marines whose kill teams are responsible for responding to these dangerous alien forces. The second note to be made about the Imperium of Man is more of a contextual thing, and it's about the planets within the Imperium. It should be no surprise that a hyper-advanced civilization that has been rebuilt from ruins has developed a bunch of specialized worlds to suit their needs, but for the Imperium of Man, it's a whole other extreme. Worlds are classified according to their purpose, and their purpose occupies everything of what they are. Hive worlds are stripped barren save for their great hive cities, where billions of individuals can live stacked one on top of each other, ready to work in some menial task or to be conscripted as guardsmen for the Astra Militarum. These are the grinding, attritional lifeblood centers of humanity, where as many as billions of individuals can be found within a single hive city. Forge worlds are predominantly maintained by the Adeptus Mechanicus and are entirely dedicated to the production of technology and equipment for the Imperium of Man, from the most basic of las pistols to the most advanced of titans. They are the factories of the Imperium, belching out smoke and machines of war day and night without relent. Grave worlds are where the Imperium of Man buries its honored dead, with few residing on the world save for those that tend the graves and those that lie within them. Whilst some worlds like hive worlds are reserved for trillions of those who live upon them, grave worlds are reserved for trillions of dead who lie at rest. Fortress worlds are impregnable bastions of the Imperium, which will only fold and falter under the most extreme of duress. Some fortress worlds, like the now destroyed planet of Cadia, have become so famous as to make their equipment and tactical doctrines, and even their soldiers, commonplace across the Imperium at large. When the Imperium claims a planet, they go on to give it a designation and thus a function. So if you see the towering spires at the apex of a hive world, or the endless tombstones of a grave world, or the vast foundries of a forge world, don't be surprised. These are the mechanisms of a galactic human state whose agenda can be summarized by a single word: war. And there is certainly war to be found in the dark future of the 42nd millennium. And whilst the Imperium is spreading its forces across many wars and many battlefields, there is one looming war and threat that is seemingly more pressing than any other in the galaxy. They are the unending swarm, the bane of worlds from Tyranid to Macragge, the Great Devourer, the Tyranids. To describe the Tyranids is to chart out the darkest possible answer to the Fermi paradox, one where all life in the galaxy has been snuffed out because something else has consumed it all. Named after the first Imperial planet that they consumed, The Tyranid hive fleets are a force unlike anything else seen in the galaxy. They have no technology, so to speak of, and are an entirely biological force, one whose greatest weapons are their adaptability and power of their own evolution and genetics. This advantage of genetics and evolution is so extreme that it outpaces cutting-edge technologies deployed against the hive fleets with alarming speed and effectiveness. To put it simply, if you start bringing explosive ordnance, the Tyranids will evolve harder chitinous armor or burrowing claws so they can pass through the earth to avoid your weapons fire. If you develop stronger armor in return, they will evolve sharper teeth and stronger jaws to rip through it. No matter what the technology, no matter what the tactic, when it's deployed against the Tyranids, it won't take long for them to develop a countermeasure. That is the power of the hive fleets. Describing the Tyranids genetically is a hard task. On initial observation, the hive fleets look like a great assembly of xenos from separate species that share some similar traits. Some huge and armored, some small and nimble. But all of these organisms are Tyranids. They are just different morphs of Tyranids. Even their great hive fleet vessels are simply monstrous living entities that are still Tyranids. They're just large enough to give even the greatest vessels of the Imperial Navy pause for thought. All Tyranids are formed in response to the environment presented to them, but not all organisms are the same. If found alone in a vacuum and separated from their hive fleets, the smaller creatures, such as the Hormagaunts and Termagants, are mostly just drone-like animals with minimal intelligence, but larger swarm creatures, from warriors to raveners to zoanthropes and so on, are key to holding the whole swarm together. This is because of the binding synaptic link, the psychic fabric that ties the whole of the Tyranid swarm as one. Killing these stronger synapse creatures will destabilize those weaker creatures around them. Conversely, the ferocity and strength of a Tyranid force is far greater when they are led by such synapse creatures. Follow this psychic link up the chain, and eventually you'll reach the most powerful Tyranid bioforms, including the Hive Tyrant, which is the closest thing that the Tyranids have to a battlefield commander. Should a Hive Tyrant fall in battle, a crippling psychic wave will pass out from it, destroying the cohesion of the Tyranids for miles around. Needless to say, the elimination of Hive Tyrants is a crucial objective when facing the Tyranids. But sadly, such endeavors can only bear fruit so many times before they ultimately become pointless. There are two reasons for this. The first is that as far as the tactics of a Hive Tyrant are concerned, they will be remembered across death. If one is destroyed, the swarm's Norn Queens will quickly reconstitute it, and it will have remembered how it died. It will have learned from the battlefield. It will remember the tactics that put it to the sword. This means that a Hive Tyrant can return and will be even more ferocious and capable of destroying those that face it once again. But the second reason for this is a far simpler and far more terrifying reason. The Tyranids do not care for losses on the battlefield. If they need to throw the entirety of their force against a bastion to take it, even with extreme casualties, they will do exactly that. Even if they achieve victory by only a single warrior or gaunt, they will have won, and that is what's important. Because for the Tyranids, losses like this are of little consequence. This is because of the extraordinary life cycle and greater function of the Hive fleets, which revolves with little exception around a single goal: hunger. The consumption of biomass. When a Tyranid Hive fleet attacks a world, they will overwhelm its defenders until they are victorious, and then they will systematically harvest the planet until it is barren. To make this absolutely clear, when I mean harvest, I don't mean kill all living things and then leave. The Tyranids are not here for meat, they are here for biomass. Sapient species, microbial life, native fauna and flora, useful chemical compounds, everything. The forests of an arboreal world will be consumed root and trunk. The oceans of a water world will be drained till their last, deepest drops. After the invasion of a world by the Tyranids is completed, the process of consumption begins thanks to smaller Tyranid creatures like Rippers. They will deliver all useful material back to the Hive Fleet's massive capillary towers that feed their great Hive Fleet vessels. This includes any dead Tyranids who are unceremoniously returned to the hive, melted down, and reformed. No biomass is lost, and so even if victory is attained by a single Tyranid bioform, it is already over. The swarm has won, and their strength has not truly been depleted. All this biomass that's returned to the hive will then be extracted, and then can be used in the next invasion, where more Tyranid bioforms can be reformed from the dead. When the Tyranids leave a world behind in their passing, all that is left is a rock hollow of life and devoid of any promise or hope. Such is the utter brutality and total nature of their victory. Not a whisper of their defeated foes will remain when the Tyranids are done consuming a world. Only silence, and nothing more. This is why they are known as the Great Devourer, for it is not simply a single planet that they thirst for. Their hunger is unending, and given the chance, they will consume the entire galaxy to feed their ravenous fleets. Responding to Tyranid hive fleets is no small task either, not merely because of the ferocity of the Tyranids themselves, but also for the isolating effects that the Tyranids bring with them. A consequence of their massive hive mind is an effect on the Imperium known as the Shadow in the Warp. The sheer number of Tyranid bioforms within a given system and the massive nature of their hive mind disrupts the very fabric of the Imperium itself, blocking any with psychic abilities from connecting to it with any degree of efficacy. For the Imperium of Man, this is a terrifying ability to contest, because they use psychers such as astropaths for communication and navigators for transit through the warp. This means that once a hive fleet has chosen its target and established its presence properly, a world is effectively isolated from the rest of the galaxy. For those finding themselves in the midst of a full-scale Tyranid invasion, there is no escape, and there will be no reinforcements. They will have to face the unending swarm alone. One of the primary foes you face in Space Marine 2 is a splinter of a Tyranid hive fleet, meaning that they're not even at full strength and are somewhat separated, but they are ferocious adversaries nonetheless. Worse still, a splinter from a hive fleet means that the main invading body might not be too far behind, and a fully fledged hive fleet taking notice of a world spells its almost certain doom, for the numbers of the Tyranids within a true hive fleet are practically endless. Such is the nature of the hive fleet's advance. It is unstoppable, it is ceaseless, it is ravenous, and they are legion. Many Tyranid hive fleets have infiltrated our galaxy from different points on the periphery of the Milky Way, and though each hive fleet has shown its own unique genetic modifications, there is a great fear amongst Imperial strategists that the hive fleets we have seen now are merely the first exploratory tendrils reaching up into the galaxy from something greater. For it may be the case that the exact scale of the hive fleets remains unknown. Some hive fleet arms like Behemoth have been effectively stopped in their tracks at great cost, but every decade more hive fleets appear from other directions. Most menacing of all is Hive Fleet Leviathan, which is breaching the galaxy from beneath the galactic plane in multiple locations. This has left one simple, grim conclusion for Imperial planners to contemplate. The galaxy may be surrounded, and whenever you look up to the stars, the hungry eyes of the Tyranids may well be staring back. This threat, this existential terror, is perhaps best presented with this image, and shows perhaps the enormity of the swarm that lies beyond the edge of the galaxy. Many have tried to oppose the Tyranids, and even though individual campaigns might be successful, there is one certainty: there will almost always be more of them. But astoundingly, such an existential threat from the stars without, despite being of utmost concern to the Imperium, is not considered the greatest threat to its citizens. There are those threats that reside within. Most insidious of all is the corrupting influence of chaos. We've already mentioned Chaos and the Chaos Gods in passing thanks to the recounting of the Horus heresy that we just did, but we also need to account for the fact that the forces of Chaos are not solely forces of humanity that have been corrupted by entities beyond the stars. The forces of Chaos originate primarily from the Warp, and are also made up of hosts of corrupted cultists and demons. But what is a demon technically, and what is the Warp? Well, I explained earlier that the Warp is kind of like space hell on steroids, but that doesn't truly sell the reality of it. So, let's explain the Chaos Gods and the Imperium. When the universe of 40K was young, the Imperium and the Warp were also relatively calm and empty. The Warp, in many ways, was a little bit like a psychic reflection of the material world. But whenever beings with souls were born into the material universe, there would be consequences in the Imperium as well. As beings with souls existed and experienced life in all its fashions, their emotions and psychic experiences resonated with the Warp, leaving impressions upon it. At first, perhaps there was a balance, some positive and much negative, but negative emotions are the strongest, and within a place such as the Warp, such emotions quickly would have boiled over. With enough impressions left on the Warp, it would become more and more chaotic, and eventually the most powerful concentrations of psychic power and energy would coalesce into beings of terrible grandeur. These are the gods of chaos. There are 4 of them within the greater pantheon. The almighty Khorne, the blood god who sits upon the skull throne, who is empowered by violence, rage, and war. Grandfather Nurgle, the god of plague and pestilence, who is empowered by the very state of entropy, as well as disease, decay, and despair. The changer of ways, Tzeentch, the great trickster god who is empowered by ambition, schemes, knowledge, and sorcery. And the latest chaos god to join the pantheon, the profane dark prince of excess, Slaanesh, who is empowered by pain, pleasure, hedonism, and perfectionism. Each of these 4 chaos gods can choose to separate with a small portion of their essence to create a being that is lesser than themselves. This is how a demon is created. Within each demon that one might face in battle, there is a reflection of the chaos god that created it. Demons of Khorne, such as bloodthirsters and bloodletters, are ferocious martial combatants, with blood-red skin and a desire for direct confrontation that boils into ferocity with ease. Demons of Tzeentch, on the other hand, such as Lords of Change and Chaos Horrors, tend to be twisted, freakish abominations with a greater aptitude for magic that will often deceive their enemies to make slaying them easier. Demonhood is not just something that happens normally within the Warp. It is something seen as a gift that the Dark Gods can bestow upon their chosen champions. Some who embrace the touch of the ruinous powers are simply warped into abominations and succumb to their mutations and madness. But for their most powerful servants, the Chaos Gods will grant the boon of ascension into a demon prince. These blighted individuals have given up their souls in return for life everlasting and power beyond the wildest imaginings of even their most tainted brethren. But acquiring such a boon is no small feat. To gain the attention of the Dark Gods is the aspiration of every Chaos Lord and Sorcerer, and doing so requires the burning of whole planets and stars, or the acquisition of a singular power that is of specific interest to the gods of the Warp. And speaking of a singular power that can draw the attention of these Chaos Gods, I think it's about high time that we go over the plot of the first Space Marine game so that you're all caught up on that. In both the first and second Space Marine games, you play as Titus, a high-ranking Space Marine and member of the Ultramarines chapter. They're historically significant, as they are the direct successor and remnant of the Ultramarines Legion. meaning that they're one of the oldest and most powerful Space Marine chapters in the Imperium. Their Primarch, Robuta Guilliman, has ascended to the rank of War Master, and is one of the only remaining sons of the Emperor who still lives. He has ascended beyond their ranks to command the whole of the Imperium at large. The chapter that bears his old legion's namesake is instead now commanded by one of his greatest warriors, Chapter Master Manius Calgar, a peerless warrior who has fought the Tyranids and the forces of chaos before. As it was Primarch Robuta Guilliman who wrote the Codex Astartes, the Ultramarines in particular hold it in especially high regard, and are often unswerving when it comes to their conformity to its doctrines. However, as captain of the Ultramarines, Demetrian Titus was one to play somewhat looser with his interpretation of the Codex and its doctrines. His story for us began with the distant forge world of Graia. Within the bowels of this steel world were foundries that produced some of the Imperium of man's greatest war machines, the mighty warlord-class Titans. Unfortunately, the facilities on Graia had drawn the eyes of ravenous looters. They were being assaulted by the Orc War of a boss known as Grimskull, and they sought to take the planet's loot and scrap for themselves. There were many options that the Imperium could have used to respond to this invading war. One such option might have been orbital bombardment, but the Titan facilities were of critical importance and could not be damaged. For the same reason, the act of utterly destroying the world entirely, exterminatus, was also ruled out. The Titan facilities had to be held at all costs, and so the Ultramarines' second company was deployed to retake the world from the Orcs. Titus would personally lead a squad of 2 other Ultramarines, Sergeant Sidonus and battle brother Leandros. Plummeting through the debris of broken Imperial ships and Orc vessels, they would eventually make planetfall and push to secure the Titan manufactorums. But along the way they encountered something unexpected. A servo skull, bearing the markings of the Inquisition. As the Inquisition holds authority above even the Astartes, the Space Marines were bound to listen to the message of the skull. It showed them a transmission sent out from one Inquisitor Drogon. His request was urgent, and he was clearly under duress at Manufactorum Ajakis. Drogon stated that there was an experimental device of some sort. His orders were to keep the device out of enemy hands at all cost. He also made mention of a weapon that was nearly complete. After recovering Drogon in the Manufactorum, Titus and his squadron were informed that the device was a power source, one that was at the time powering the entire Titan Manufactorum. It was, however, unstable, and so Titus and his squad would need to immediately retrieve it to keep it out of the hands of the Orc warboss, who was hot in pursuit. Failure to do so could mean that the planet itself would be cracked in half. Strangely, when they met Inquisitor Drogon, the squad noticed that he had clearly been injured. There was a massive gash or 2 across his chest that had burned down through his armor into his skin. At the time being, it appeared that this was the result of Orc invaders, and that Drogon had barely survived his encounter. He was only able to still stand thanks to his psychic abilities, which he was using to staunch the flow of blood and keep himself alive. Such injuries at first were notable, but didn't spark too much suspicion. Captain Titus eventually made his way down to the power source and retrieved it, but removing the device from its housing sent the entire facility crashing down around him. The device seemed to radiate a baleful sort of energy, but Titus was somehow able to survive his interaction with the device, containing it and escaping. Upon rendezvousing once again with his squadron and Drogon, the Inquisitor confirmed that the power source had resonated with the warp, energies of the realm of chaos itself. He expressed a remarkable degree of interest in Titus's ability to resist the warp. Upon mentioning the realm of chaos, the reaction from Titus's squad was severe, as one might expect, with Leandros in particular reacting with the same kind of harsh zeal that is typical of the Imperium's faithful. As Leandros called him a heretic, Drogon quickly retorted to the accusation, saying that his work was officially sanctioned by the Imperium. As an Inquisitor, Drogon's word on the matter would be final, but the suspicions of the entire squad would be piqued from now on. Drogon stated that the device was meant to be integrated into an untested experimental superweapon known as the Psychic Scourge. The Psychic Scourge was designed in such a way that it would be able to interact with specific Xenos species and destroy them utterly from within their own minds. Such a weapon would be a counter to most threats facing the Imperium of mankind if used correctly and experimented with caution. This would of course include the Orc War that was currently invading the planet. And so, the decision was made. The weapon would be fired. They were running out of options. With the assistance of 2nd Lieutenant Mira of the Astra Militarum's 203rd Cadian Shock Regiment, the Ultramarines and Drogon made their way to the Psychic Scourge, battling through thousands of invading orcs to reach the weapon and power it up. The weapon was aimed at one of the planet's orbital spires, a space elevator-like construct used to ferry goods and materials between the planet and space. Seeing little other choice to stop the Orc invasion and keep the power source out of the Warboss's plans, Captain Titus and Inquisitor Drogon fired the Psychic Scourge, hoping to end the invasion there by destroying every single Orc. This should have put a swift end to the planetary invasion. But such easy victories are often fleeting dreams for the Imperium's defenders. In seeking to end one invasion, Titus had merely ushered in another. The Orcs rose from the backlash of the Psychic Scourge undamaged, and strange warp energies began to cover the surface of Graia. As the orbital spire cracked and buckled, the warp energies there began to bloom into an unholy portal, a tear into the Immaterium. A power beyond this world had been put to use, and a power beyond had reached back in kind. A portal to the warp had opened. The true perpetrators strode through. A vanguard of the Blood God's chosen demons, bloodletters of Khorne, poured forth and slaughtered the orcs surrounding the weapon, and then, striding through after them, was the Chaos God's chosen. A Chaos Lord and Sorcerer of the Dark Powers Undivided appeared before Titus and his squad. His name was Nemeroth, and the first stage of his plan was now complete. Inquisitor Drogon approached Nemeroth, stepping past the toothy maws and barbed swords of the demons, before kneeling to this champion of the Dark Gods. Nemeroth revealed the truth in that moment. The real Inquisitor Drogon had been dead before Titus ever met him. This reanimated, puppeted body of Drogon was merely meant to deliver the power source to Nemeroth, and nothing more. It is possible then that the heavy wound on Drogon's chest was not the work of orcs at all, but was instead a mortal wound from a servant of chaos, which sent the Inquisitor to the grave, and his body into their service. As Nemeroth addressed his forces, Titus and his squadron were forced to their knees by dark sorcery. But much as he had done before with the device, Titus showed a remarkable resistance to the energies of the warp. He crawled forth and managed to lay a hand upon the power source. Before Nemeroth could stop Titus, the Orc warboss Grimskull intervened and began to do battle with the Chaos Lord, sending them both tumbling into the lower levels of the facility. Taking advantage of this reprieve, the Ultramarines quickly regrouped and fled with the power source. As they fled, the dynamic of the war on Graia was completely changed. Warboss Grimskull's war was now embattled against the demons of chaos and the Chaos Space Marines that had followed Nemeroth through the warp. The Chaos Lords chosen were flooding out into the planet, corrupting guardsmen and turning them mad. The already beleaguered 203rd Cadian Shock Regiment continued to hold the line diligently where they could, but the picture of this war was now clear. The Orc invasion might no longer be the true threat, and the Chaos invasion would consume the entire planet all the same if it wasn't quickly stopped. In response to this, Captain Titus and his squad quickly worked to enact a plan that would accomplish just that. Manufactorum Ajakis still housed the warlord Titan Invictus. Its princeps and moderati operators were now able to assist Titus, and their goal would be to target the orbital spire where the Chaos Portal was located. To this end, Titus integrated the power source into Invictus's volcano cannon, infusing it with even further degrees of astronomical power from the source. As Invictus fired its weapon, blinding light radiated forth across the surface of Graia. The Titan's systems were overloaded, but it seemed like the gambit had paid off. The spire's buckling structure finally broke, and for but a moment, the energies of the portal seemed to dissipate a little. It was not completely destroyed, but the initiative had been won back. In the aftermath of this successful action, Titus and his squad would move quickly to escort the power source off-world, but there had long been brewing suspicions amongst the squad. Leandros had made his thoughts clear. Earlier at their confrontation in front of the Psychic Scourge, Lord Nemeroth had taunted Captain Titus for his role in ushering in the Chaos Invasion, and noted his unusual resistance to the touch of the warp with much fascination, a trait that normally is gifted to the Dark God's followers. This, in combination with Titus's prior handling of the device without much meaningful harm, was enough to make Leandros accuse him potentially of heresy. Heresy and chaos corruption are insidious threats, but Titus was pure of spirit and mind. Sergeant Sidonus, who had known Titus the longest, quickly shut down the Battle Brothers' assertions. Even if they had had the time to address these assertions, Chaos forces would soon be on the move again, and they would hound the squadron as they moved further. Now their objective was simple. They needed to take the power source off-world, and keep it away from the Chaos Lord at all costs. Handing the power source off to Sidonus, Leandros and Titus would cover his escape and regroup with him at the landing pad. Unfortunately, this left Sidonus isolated, and an opening like this was exactly what Nemeroth was looking for. Before they could escape, Nemeroth appeared through a portal, ambushing Sidonus, impaling him upon his lightning claw and claiming the power source for himself. Before Titus could stop him, Nemeroth informed him of the power within the device, and that it was the key to his ascension into the Demon Prince of Chaos that he wished to become. Taking the device and leaving, Nemeroth's true objective had almost been accomplished. Now he had everything he needed for his ascension. Captain Titus would lay Sidonus, his old friend, to rest, and then would swear vengeance and justice. As Chaos forces descended upon the planet once more, a contingent of Space Marines from the Liberation Fleet above in orbit had started to break through. Ultramarines, Blood Ravens, and Black Templars all took part in the assault on the orbital spire, and Titus would carve through the heretical host with them, making his way to the spire to face Nemeroth. Titus would arrive in time to confront the Chaos Lord, but he would be too late to prevent Nemeroth's transformation. Battling against his minions and then Nemeroth himself, Titus would take the terms of the final confrontation into his own hands. He charged Nemeroth, sending himself and the Chaos Lord plummeting towards the ground from the top of the broken spire. Nemeroth and Titus would battle as they fell through the air. Beams of chaos energy and bolter rounds shot back and forth. Eventually, though, Nemeroth would be crushed at Titus's hands. But even as the Chaos Lord faded into the Imperium, Titus could hear the now Demon Prince's taunting voice, asking if they would at some point meet again soon, and provoking the question of whether Chaos had truly corrupted the captain. Titus would, however, not be fazed. As the power source fell, and as Nemeroth had died, Titus grabbed it, took hold of it in both his hands, and shattered it into shards. The detonation of the device would send what remained of the orbital spire crumbling down. Titus would have met his death on that day if not for the valiant interception of the Thunderhawk gunship Lance of Jove, which recovered him before he could hit the ground. Returned to the surface of Graia, Titus awoke from the great battle, but there was little to celebrate, as soon he would be approached by Leandros, the squadron of Black Templars that had aided in the assault on the spire, and another Inquisitor by the name of Thrax. Leandros made his pointed accusation in that moment. He made it clear that he believed Captain Titus was a heretic. and Thrax was inclined to agree. The choice before the Ultramarines captain was bleak: submit to the terrors of the Inquisition and suffer if they should find his actions to have been heretical in any way, or endanger those that aided him in destroying Nemeroth and dishonor the Ultramarines chapter. But those that know the Ultramarines know that one of their war cries is courage and honor. And Titus would hold true to those words. He would not dishonor his chapter, and so he bravely submitted himself to the judgment of the Inquisition, but not before making it clear to Leandros, his battle brother, that though he had followed the Codex Astartes and clung to it for guidance, he had failed to live up to its spirit, and thus had failed as a space marine. The Inquisitor known as Thrax would take Titus off-world, and in Thrax's clutches, Titus would be subjected to terrible interrogations and torture in an attempt to determine if he was in fact tainted by chaos. But no evidence of corruption was discovered. Even with this, though, Titus was not released. As it turns out, Thrax held a grudge against the Astartes. In a series of events that eventually led to Thrax's corruption and death by chaos, Titus was released from his imprisonment in stasis and was sent, mercifully, to the Death Watch, an elite organization of Astartes Xenos hunters under the command of the Ordo Xenos. For over a century, Titus was separated from his chapter and its colors. Even though there was no proof of corruption to be found, the accusation of heresy alone was a stain upon Titus, and so he became a Black Shield, the markings of the Ultramarines chapter scoured from his armor as he worked to earn his redemption. A redemption that would present itself soon enough. Space Marine 2 picks up with Captain Titus and his Death Watch squadron on a critical mission to deliver a virus bomb to the heart of an encroaching Tyranid hive fleet. The battles that plagued him at Graia are long dead and gone, but the ghosts of that campaign still haunt his actions. Despite all of this, his iron will is unbroken, his faith in the Emperor is still pure, his wrathful might is unfaded. The darkness of the 42nd millennium presses in from all angles, a darkness against which he must now stand until his last breath. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider going ahead and subscribing as I cover more lore from the stories of Space Marine 2 and other universes near and far. If you enjoyed the video, please go ahead and also remember to leave a like. And if you have your own thoughts, leave them down below in the comments section. Assuming this does well, I'll also cover the lore from Space Marine 2 for a little bit. You'll get a few select videos including various details we learn about the plot, and some questions that you might have within the comments could get answered. But, as per usual, know that your viewership, as always, is quite enough for me. And in the meantime, my name is Bife. Audacia ad Astra. I'll see you, Starside.